Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, easing ourselves into an era when the internet was a fantastical dream, and information came bound in leather and cloth. Imagine the creak of polished wood underfoot, the scent of aged paper and leather, the soft glow of gaslight falling upon towering shelves. You're standing on the threshold of a Victorian public library, a sanctuary of silence in a bustling, sooty world. Dust motes dance in the slivers of light, each one a tiny, forgotten story, suspended in the cool, still air. Honestly, you're about to fall asleep, which means you probably won't remember half of what I tell you. But hey, that's the point, isn't it? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always cool to see how far these quiet whispers travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself on a damp, gas-lit street. The muffled sounds of horse-drawn carriages and distant street hawkers barely reaching your ears. The air is thick with the scent of coal smoke and damp earth. But ahead, a grand, often imposing building looms, its stone facade a testament to Victorian civic pride. Perhaps it's neoclassical, with stately columns and an air of quiet authority. You push open a heavy oak door, and the clamor of the city immediately recedes, replaced by a profound, almost spiritual hush. It's like stepping into a giant, silent honeycomb, each cell filled with untold stories. The air here is different, cooler, imbued with the faint, comforting aroma of old paper, a subtle perfume that whispers of knowledge and time. You feel your shoulders drop, your breathing deepen, as if the very atmosphere encourages tranquility. Your eyes adjust to the softer, warmer glow of gaslight, or perhaps the diffuse light filtering through enormous arched windows high above. Rows upon rows of dark, sturdy bookshelves stretch towards the vaulted ceilings, disappearing into the lofty shadows. This isn't your brightly lit minimalist modern library with its charging stations and co-working spaces. Oh no. This is a monument to printed matter, a temple of the intellect, where the main sound you're likely to hear is the gentle rustle of turning pages, or perhaps the distant, polite cough of a fellow scholar. The sense of awe is immediate and overwhelming. You're surrounded by millions of words, by the collected wisdom and folly of centuries, all neatly arranged, waiting patiently for your attention. It's a bit like wandering into a very dusty, very quiet, and infinitely more fascinating version of your great-aunt Mildred's attic. The very existence of such a place for public access was, in itself, a revolutionary concept for the time. Before the mid-19th century, access to large collections of books was largely the privilege of the wealthy, academics, or members of exclusive societies. But the Public Libraries Act of 1850 marked a significant shift, laying the groundwork for a network of public libraries across Britain, aiming to provide education and moral uplift to the working classes. This wasn't just about charity. It was seen as a way to improve society, to provide alternatives to the public house, and to foster self-improvement. They genuinely believed that a good book could cure what ails you, including your penchant for gin. As you wander deeper into the main reading room, you notice the carefully placed heavy wooden tables, often with individual reading lamps, perhaps early gas lamps, which, while illuminating, also presented a constant fire hazard in a building filled with highly flammable material. One small spark, and you'd have a very well-read bonfire. The librarians of the era must have had nerves of steel, or at least a very good relationship with the local fire brigade. The quiet is enforced, almost palpable. You instinctively lower your voice, even to yourself. There's an unwritten code, a silent agreement amongst those who seek solace and knowledge within these hallowed halls. And yet, for all the grand intentions, historians still argue whether these early public libraries truly served all segments of society equally, or if they remained, in practice, more accessible to the burgeoning middle class than the very poorest who might have struggled with literacy or simply couldn't afford the time away from work. It's a reminder that even the noblest intentions can have unintended social stratification. You sense the presence of others, hunched over books, their forms absorbed in concentration. And then you see them, the silent guardians of this immense repository. They move with an almost imperceptible grace, their steps soft, their gazes attentive. These are the Victorian librarians, the unsung heroes who meticulously cataloged, cared for, and guarded these precious volumes. They are the quiet heart of this grand institution, ensuring that the knowledge contained within these walls remains accessible, organized, and preserved for generations to come. Their work is a ballet of quiet dedication, a constant performance for an audience that rarely notices their subtle movements, only the smooth availability of information. You watch them, these quiet figures moving amongst the towering shelves, their very presence a gentle reminder of the hushed reverence this space demands. They are not boisterous or flamboyant. Instead, their power lies in their meticulousness, their dedication, and their seemingly boundless patience. You might observe a librarian, perhaps a stern-looking gentleman with spectacles perched on his nose, carefully dusting a row of leather-bound volumes with a soft cloth, or a younger assistant meticulously cross-referencing entries in a vast ledger. Their attire is usually simple, utilitarian, blending seamlessly with the serious academic atmosphere, like a perfectly seasoned extra in a particularly important play. No flashy ties or neon cardigans here. Thank you very much. Their days, you imagine, are a symphony of small, precise movements and silent rituals. It's not just about pointing you to the correct shelf. Oh no, that's merely the tip of the intellectual iceberg. A Victorian librarian's duties were exhaustive, stretching far beyond what you might expect from someone who primarily deals with books. You'd see them mending torn pages with a dexterity that would shame a surgeon, their fingers almost dancing as they applied paste and tissue. They were guardians of the collection, quite literally, protecting books from the twin scourges of time and careless readers. Imagine patching up thousands of books annually, each one a tiny act of preservation. It was less about waving a magic wand and more about elbow grease and a whole lot of paper glue. Beyond the physical care of the books, their primary all-encompassing task was cataloging. This wasn't a simple barcode scan and a database entry. This was the painstaking work of creating order from a vast, ever-growing sea of ink and paper. Each new acquisition had to be carefully assessed, classified, and meticulously recorded in large, often handwritten, ledgers. Think about it: a new book arrives, perhaps a treatise on steam engines or a volume of poetry. The librarian would have to decide where it fit in the grand scheme of human knowledge, assign it a unique identifier, and then transcribe its details: title, author, publisher, subject, with pen and ink, ensuring perfect legibility. A single mistake could send a reader on a wild goose chase, a perilous journey through dusty corridors that could take hours, or at least a good 15 minutes. Their subtle authority wasn't just about maintaining silence. It extended to controlling access to knowledge itself. Before the widespread adoption of open access shelving, many libraries operated on a closed stack system. You, the reader, couldn't just browse the shelves. Instead, you'd consult a weighty, often handwritten, catalog. Fill out a request slip with the specific book's details, and then hand it to a librarian. The librarian would then, with a solemn nod, disappear into the labyrinthine stacks, emerging, hopefully, with your desired volume. This system gave librarians immense power. They were the intermediaries, the gatekeepers. If they didn't approve of your choice, or if the book was deemed inappropriate for public consumption, especially for younger or female readers, you might find your request politely denied. Historians still argue whether this gatekeeping was a necessary evil for managing vast collections and maintaining public morality, or if it inadvertently restricted access to certain ideas and perpetuated social biases. It's worth noting that the path to becoming a Victorian librarian wasn't always a direct academic one. While the profession was slowly gaining recognition, with early discussions about formal training beginning to emerge, many early librarians were appointed more for their character and perceived reliability than for specific library science qualifications. In fact, a rather quirky tidbit is that a significant number of early librarians, particularly in smaller regional institutions, were often retired gentlemen of letters, or even, in some cases, disabled soldiers who needed a respectable and less physically demanding occupation after their service. Their knowledge of books was often self-taught, accumulated through years of personal reading and a genuine love for literature, rather than formalized education. So your quiet, bespectacled librarian might have once been a grizzled veteran of the Crimean War, meticulously mending a torn Dickens novel. Quite a thought, isn't it? The public perception of librarians was a mixed bag. On one hand, they were respected figures of learning and order, often seen as pillars of their community. On the other, they were sometimes viewed as somewhat eccentric, perhaps a little dull, tucked away amongst their books, far from the real world. You might hear a joke about a librarian being so quiet they could hear a pin drop in a feather factory. But beneath that quiet exterior lay a profound dedication. They understood the transformative power of books, the silent revolution contained within each page, and they saw themselves as crucial facilitators of that change. They weren't just stamping books, they were building minds, one carefully cataloged volume at a time. As you continue your quiet journey through the Victorian Library, your gaze drifts from the meticulous librarian to the very architecture that envelops you. These weren't just buildings, they were statements, bold declarations of civic ambition and a profound belief in the power of knowledge. You step into the main reading hall, and your head tilts back almost instinctively, following the lines of towering, often ornate columns that ascend to a soaring ceiling. It's usually a vaulted affair, sometimes intricately plastered or adorned with subdued academic murals. The sheer scale is designed to impress, to inspire a sense of reverence. Much like a grand cathedral, only instead of sermons, you receive wisdom. The light, you notice, plays a crucial role. During the day, vast arched windows, sometimes fitted with frosted or stained glass, flood the space with a soft, diffused glow, ensuring that no harsh, direct sunlight damages the delicate pages of the books. This natural illumination was paramount, especially in an age before ubiquitous electric light. Imagine the quiet hush of a late afternoon, the sunbeams slanting across the wooden tables, illuminating the dust motes like tiny, sparkling galaxies. It's almost cinematic, isn't it? At night, the gaslight, as we briefly touched upon, would cast warm, flickering pools of light, creating an intimate, almost conspiratorial atmosphere for those lingering late over their studies. Though, let's be honest, those early gaslights also hummed a bit, smelled faintly of gas, and had a delightful habit of making your eyes water after a few hours of intense reading. Definitely an improvement over candlelight, but still a far cry from your modern LED reading lamp. The materials themselves speak volumes. You feel the cool, smooth surface of polished oak on the reading tables, perhaps even the slightly rough texture of stone balustrades on a grand staircase leading to upper galleries. Dark, rich woods like mahogany and walnut were favored for shelving and paneling, exuding an air of permanence and solemnity. Ornate ironwork might adorn staircases or decorative grills, adding a touch of industrial elegance that was cutting edge for the era. The architecture often leaned heavily into classical revival or Gothic revival styles, borrowing elements from ancient Greece and Rome or medieval cathedrals, reflecting the Victorian fascination with history and their desire to associate knowledge with timeless grandeur. It wasn't just a place to read, it was a place designed to make you feel important, to feel like you were participating in something monumental just by being there. While these grand designs were certainly awe-inspiring, they weren't without their quirks. Heating these cavernous spaces was a monumental challenge. Imagine trying to warm a building with ceilings 40 feet high using a few coal fires or early steam radiators. You'd likely find yourself in a constant battle between freezing drafts near the windows and stuffy, overheated pockets near the few heat sources. A quirky tidbit is that despite all the architectural ambition, many libraries struggled with adequate ventilation, often leading to air that was either stagnant and dusty or uncomfortably chilly. You can practically hear the subtle sniffles of patrons trying to concentrate in a less than ideal climate, silently cursing the architect's grand vision over practical comfort. Yes, it's beautiful, but I can't feel my fingers. You might have thought. You walk past rows of heavy, unyielding chairs, designed more for durability than ergonomics. They might look like they belong in a very serious boardroom meeting rather than a cozy reading nook. Yet, for those who spent hours poring over texts, they were a welcome respite, a place to sit and be still. In some larger institutions, you might even find separate reading rooms, like a ladies' reading room, perhaps, or a specific periodicals room, each designed to cater to slightly different needs and social norms. The segregation of spaces wasn't just about decorum. It was a reflection of the era's rigid social structures, even within the seemingly egalitarian walls of a public library. And this brings us to an interesting point of contention. For all their architectural magnificence and public funding, historians still argue whether the sheer grandiosity of these Victorian library buildings was truly welcoming to the working classes they were ostensibly built to serve. Was a factory worker, perhaps intimidated by the imposing facade and hushed interiors, as likely to enter and feel comfortable as a middle-class scholar? Or did the very majesty of the space inadvertently create a barrier, suggesting that this realm of knowledge was perhaps not truly for them? It's a question that delves into the subtle psychological impact of design and how intention doesn't always translate perfectly into experience. You stand there, surrounded by all this solemn beauty, and you wonder who is truly meant to feel at home here from the stately grandeur of the reading rooms. Your mind inevitably turns to the hidden complexities that made such a vast collection usable. Imagine, for a moment, being faced with tens of thousands, eventually hundreds of thousands of books. How do you find anything? How do you ensure that when someone asks for that novel about the grumpy old man and the orphans, you can actually locate it amongst the endless rows? This was the silent, monumental challenge faced by Victorian librarians, bringing order to what could very quickly become intellectual chaos. In the very early days, before standardized systems, libraries often used what was called fixed location cataloging. This meant a book was simply given a shelf number, and that's where it stayed, permanently. If you acquired a new book that logically belonged between two others, tough luck. You'd have to place it at the end of the shelf, or create an entirely new section. It was like trying to organize your wardrobe by putting every new shirt on top of the last, regardless of color or type. Pretty quickly, you'd have a chaotic tower of textile despair. This system meant that if you rearranged the shelves, your entire catalog became instantly obsolete. A librarian's nightmare, truly. It required an encyclopedic memory of where everything was. And if that librarian left, the next poor soul was in for a wild, dusty ride. The true intellectual heavy lifting began with the development of more systematic classification. This is where you meet the unsung heroes of information science. Figures like Melville Dewey. Yes, that Dewey. In the late 19th century, his Dewey Decimal Classification DDC system began to gain widespread adoption, revolutionizing how libraries organized their collections. Instead of fixed locations, books were assigned a numerical code based on their subject matter, allowing for relative placement. So all books on, say, European history would be grouped together, and if you added a new one, it would simply slot into its proper numerical sequence. Regardless of the physical shelf space, it was a revolutionary concept, though it's safe to say Melville probably didn't envision it being used to organize cat videos on the internet. The sheer meticulousness required to apply these systems was extraordinary. Imagine a Victorian librarian hunched over a desk, a pen poised, meticulously assigning a Dewey number to a new book. Every subject, from philosophy to practical crafts, had its own numerical range. You had to understand the book's content, then apply the correct, sometimes incredibly specific, classification. It was like being a human algorithm, cross-referencing information in your brain faster than a Victorian calculating machine, which, let's be honest, probably still took 5 minutes to calculate 2 plus 2. And then, of course, they had to transcribe this information, often by hand, onto individual catalog cards or into massive leather-bound ledgers. These ledgers, with their beautiful cursive script, were themselves works of art, filled with the patient, precise handwriting of countless librarians. Forget copy-pasting. This was copywriting, word by laborious word. Speaking of Melville Dewey, while his system was ingenious, he himself was quite the character, and not without his quirks. A quirky tidbit about Dewey is that he was a fervent advocate for spelling reform, going so far as to spell his own surname Dewey for a period, and he pushed for simplified spellings within his classification system. He was also known for his rather puritanical views and, unfortunately, for instances of sexual harassment in his later career, which led to his resignation from the American Library Association. So, the genius behind your library's organization system was also a bit of a controversial figure, reminding us that even those who bring order to knowledge can be rather untidy in their personal lives. The debate about classification systems continues even today. While DDC was widely adopted, other systems like Charles Cutter's expansive classification also existed, each with its own merits and drawbacks. Historians still argue whether any classification system, no matter how logical or comprehensive, can ever be truly neutral or objective. Every system reflects the societal values, intellectual priorities, and even the biases of its creators at the time it was developed. For instance, the way certain non-Western cultures or fringe subjects were or weren't categorized in early DDC editions often reveals more about Victorian perspectives than about universal knowledge. It's a subtle reminder that even something as seemingly dry as a catalog number carries layers of historical context and human perspective. So, the next time you effortlessly type a query into a digital catalog and find your book in seconds, spare a thought for the Victorian librarians. They were the original search engines, meticulously building pathways through the dense forest of human information, one handwritten card and one carefully assigned number at a time. Their quiet diligence laid the very foundation for the organized, accessible information age we now take for granted, a testament to their profound, often unnoticed, intellectual labor, having explored the grand designs and intricate systems that shaped the Victorian Library. Let's now turn our gaze to the individuals who brought these institutions to life, the librarians themselves. You might imagine their days were filled with quiet contemplation, perhaps a leisurely read of a newly acquired novel. While moments of peaceful immersion certainly occurred, the reality of a Victorian librarian's daily life was often far more rigorous, a continuous ballet of methodical work and unwavering dedication. Your typical Victorian librarian, particularly the senior male figures or the chief librarian, would likely begin their day long before the public entered. Imagine the stillness of the empty library at dawn, the gas lights barely extinguished, leaving the vast halls in a cool, deep gloom. Their initial tasks would involve preparing the space for the day's intake of readers. This often meant a constant battle against dust, a ubiquitous enemy in an era of coal fires and unpaved streets. You can picture them, perhaps with a young assistant, meticulously wiping down the polished tables and reading stands, sweeping the grand floors and ensuring every surface gleamed with a quiet precision. A quirky tidbit here is how pervasive the dust was. The combined effects of gaslighting, coal heating, and street grime meant that a library could become incredibly dusty within hours. Librarians had to develop meticulous, almost ritualistic cleaning routines just to keep the collections from becoming completely caked. Like a fine layer of soot clinging to everything, a constant reminder of the outside world. Once the doors opened, The dynamic shifted. Their primary role became one of quiet service. You'd observe them moving with an almost silent grace between the issue desk and the labyrinthine stacks, responding to the constant stream of request slips. Each slip represented a reader's desire, a specific volume waiting to be retrieved. This involved navigating narrow aisles, climbing ladders to reach the highest shelves, and carefully extracting the requested book without disturbing the delicate balance of its neighbors. Then, upon the book's return, they would meticulously inspect it for damage, mark its return in the ledger, and carefully reshelve it in its precise location. This constant ebb and flow of books was the rhythmic heartbeat of the library. Beyond the immediate service to patrons, a significant portion of their day was dedicated to the unseen work of cataloging and bookmending. New acquisitions had to be processed, classified, accessioned, stamped with the library's mark, and then entered into the main catalog. This was painstaking intellectual labor, requiring absolute concentration and a deep understanding of the library's classification system. Then there was the ongoing task of preservation. A torn page, a loose binding, each required immediate attention to prevent further deterioration. You can envision them, armed with specialized tools, bone folders, presses, and a variety of glues, patiently stitching and patching, extending the life of countless volumes. Like quiet surgeons tending to ailing patients made of paper, their hours were undeniably long. Like many public servants of the era, Victorian librarians typically worked grueling schedules, often 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, sometimes even residing on the premises to be constantly available. The pay, while providing a respectable if modest living, was certainly not lucrative, especially compared to the immense value of the intellectual property they guarded. They were, in essence, highly educated and dedicated civil servants, but without the high salaries that sometimes accompanied other professions. Their compensation was more aligned with that of a skilled clerk than a recognized scholar, despite their deep knowledge and expertise. It wasn't a job you entered for the glamour because, let's be honest, there wasn't any, unless you found the quiet hum of a gas lamp utterly intoxicating. This brings us to a fascinating point of discussion. Historians still argue whether the job of a Victorian librarian, with its long hours, modest pay, and often solitary, repetitive tasks, was a source of genuine intellectual satisfaction and passion, or primarily a matter of quiet duty and economic necessity. Were they truly content in their silent world, driven by a profound love for books and the organization of knowledge, or was it simply a stable, respectable path for those with a quiet temperament and a good hand for penmanship? It's difficult to gauge individual contentment from the historical record, but one can imagine the quiet pride they must have felt in preserving knowledge and providing access to education, often for people who otherwise would have none. So, the next time you browse a modern library, or even scroll through an online catalog, remember the diligent, often unseen, lives of these Victorian guardians, their quiet service, their unflagging attention to detail, and their profound respect for the printed word laid the very foundation for the accessible, organized world of information we inhabit today. They were the silent cogs in a massive machine of enlightenment, turning steadily, day in and day out, ensuring the light of knowledge never dimmed. As we continue our quiet wander through the Victorian library, your attention might now settle on the very reason these grand buildings existed, and why those dedicated librarians toiled so tirelessly the books themselves. These weren't just mass-produced paperbacks you might toss into a beach bag today. Oh no. Victorian books were often physical declarations of intent, heavy things bound in sturdy cloth or rich leather, their pages thick and tactile, sometimes even with deckled edges. They were, in many ways, works of art, each carefully printed, folded, and stitched. Holding one in your hand, you feel its weight, its history. The faint scent of ink and aged paper is a far more immersive experience than simply swiping a screen. The reverence for books during this era was profound. In a world without constant digital distractions, reading was a more deliberate, considered act. A book was a window to other worlds, a tutor, a confidant, a source of moral instruction, or pure entertainment. Public libraries, by making these cherished objects accessible to a wider audience, were effectively democratizing enlightenment. But with this increased accessibility came a new set of challenges: preservation. Imagine hundreds, then thousands of hands touching the same pages, the inevitable wear and tear of a beloved object. The physical nature of Victorian books presented its own set of vulnerabilities. While many were robustly bound, the quality of paper could vary wildly. The shift towards more affordable and mass-produced books in the latter half of the century often meant using paper made from wood pulp, which, unlike earlier rag paper, contained acids that would cause it to become brittle and yellow over time. This inherent fragility meant that even the simple act of turning a page could, eventually, lead to irreparable damage. So, the very materials chosen for affordability became a long-term conservation headache. It was like building a house with lovely bricks, only to find out 20 years later they're slowly turning to dust. Beyond the internal chemistry of the paper, external threats were constant. Dust, as we've noted, was everywhere. A fine abrasive enemy that slowly wore down pages and bindings. Then there was damp, which encouraged mold and mildew, leading to those telltale musty smells and the irreversible blotches that would stain pages forever. And of course, the great uninvited guests of any library pests. A quirky tidbit is the constant battle against bookworms. Not the human kind, but actual beetle larvae that would bore holes straight through stacks of pages, leaving perfectly round tunnels of destruction. Silverfish, a tiny, creepy crawly, would munch on bindings and starchy glues. Librarians resorted to various, sometimes rather alarming, countermeasures, including dusting shelves with arsenic-laced powders because who doesn't want a side of poison with their literature, or fumigating entire sections of the library with toxic chemicals. It definitely made the staff meetings more interesting. Right, remember to air out the fiction section before opening tomorrow. Jenkins, last week's fumigation left poor Mrs. Higgins a bit green. The ambient conditions of the library itself were a constant threat. The very gaslight that allowed evening reading also emitted chemicals that accelerated the deterioration of paper. Heating systems, as we discussed, created dry or humid pockets, both equally detrimental to organic materials. Sunlight, while a beautiful source of illumination, faded inks and embrittled paper over time. It was a constant balancing act for the librarians, trying to provide a comfortable reading environment while unknowingly or knowingly, given early scientific understanding battling the elements that conspired against their cherished collections. The concept of dedicated book mending and binding within the library became a crucial aspect of preservation. Librarians, or specialized bindery staff, would meticulously repair torn pages, reattach covers, and even rebind entire volumes that had seen too much love or abuse. This wasn't a quick fix. It was a craft requiring skill, patience, and a deep understanding of book construction. They weren't just sticky taping a loose page. They were performing complex surgery to extend a book's life, ensuring future generations could still access the wisdom within. This brings us to a fundamental tension, a point where historians still argue whether the expansion of public access truly balanced with the imperative of long-term preservation. By making books readily available, were libraries inadvertently accelerating their demise? Was the wear and tear of thousands of hands on fragile pages a necessary cost for public enlightenment? Or did it represent a failure in conservation foresight? It's a classic dilemma between immediate utility and enduring legacy. And Victorian librarians were on the front lines of that quiet, constant battle, trying to ensure their fragile treasures would endure for as long as humanly possible. One patched-up page and one rebound volume at a time. From the delicate, cherished books, our focus now shifts to the other crucial element within these hallowed halls, the patrons themselves. You stand in the grand reading room, a silent observer of a fascinating tableau. Here, amidst the towering shelves and heavy oak tables, a microcosm of Victorian society quietly converged. each individual drawn by the magnetic pull of knowledge, escapism, or self-improvement. You'd see the earnest young clerk, perhaps barely out of school, hunched over a textbook, diligently preparing for a promotion examination. His brow furrowed in concentration. He's probably dreaming of a better life, a quiet escape from the dreary office ledger. Beside him, an older, respectable gentleman, a scholar or a retired professional, might be poring over ancient texts, his fingers tracing lines of Latin or Greek, lost in a world centuries away. Then there's the budding inventor, sketching diagrams on scrap paper, devouring every volume on mechanics and engineering, hoping to stumble upon the next great innovation, perhaps a better mousetrap or a really quiet kettle. The motivations for visiting were as varied as the patrons themselves. For many, especially from the burgeoning working and lower middle classes, the public library was a beacon of hope, a rare opportunity for self-education and social mobility in an era of rigid class structures. It was a place where you could acquire knowledge for free, allowing you to climb the social ladder, or at least feel like you were. For others, it was simply a warm, quiet refuge from cramped, noisy homes, or a respectable place to pass the time without the temptation of the public house. And for still others, it was pure, unadulterated escapism, a chance to lose themselves in the thrilling pages of a novel, far from the drudgery of daily life. The increase in literacy rates during the Victorian era played a pivotal role in the rise of library patronage. With the gradual implementation of compulsory education and the growing availability of cheaper books and newspapers, more people than ever before could read. This created a fertile ground for public libraries to flourish, as a newly literate populace eagerly sought access to a wider range of materials. It was a beautiful feedback loop. More people learned to read, more libraries opened, and more people read. If only we had the same passion for reading these days. Imagine a world where going viral meant everyone was talking about a new poetry collection. But for all the democratic ideals, there were unspoken, and sometimes very explicit, rules of conduct. Silence was paramount. You wouldn't hear the casual chatter or the clatter of keyboards you might find in a modern library cafe. No, here, every cough felt like a gunshot, every shuffled footstep an earthquake. Patrons were expected to be clean, sober, and respectful. Fidgeting, loud whispers, or, heaven forbid, eating a sandwich were strictly prohibited. A quirky tidbit is that some libraries were initially quite resistant to stocking fiction, viewing it as frivolous or even morally suspect. They often relegated novels to separate, less prominent sections, or restricted their loaning, believing that readers should focus on improving works of nonfiction, like agricultural manuals or treatises on etiquette. Imagine going to the library for a thrilling mystery and being told, "Sorry, dear, but have you considered this delightful volume on crop rotation?" Even with the grand intentions, historians still argue whether the Victorian public library truly achieved its democratic ideal of uplifting all classes equally. While undoubtedly vital for many, were the very poorest, who might have struggled with basic literacy, suitable attire, or even the time to visit during working hours. Genuinely able to access and benefit from these institutions, or did the inherent formality and the emphasis on self-improvement inadvertently favor the already upwardly mobile? It's a complex question, and the answer likely lies in the varied experiences across different towns and cities. And amongst diverse social groups, you also catch glimpses of a quieter social dynamic. While overt conversation was frowned upon, the library served as a subtle meeting point. People might nod in recognition, exchange a brief, knowing glance, or simply appreciate the shared silence of communal study. It was a place where you could be alone, together. In a society that often valued public appearance and formal interaction, the library offered a space for introspection, for individual growth, and for the quiet pursuit of personal interests. Free from the pressures of commerce or social obligation, it was a sanctuary, a quiet crucible where individual minds were forged and expanded, page by silent page, As you observe the quiet patrons, a new figure might catch your eye amongst the solemn male librarians, a woman, moving with the same deliberate grace, perhaps tending to the children's section, or assisting with cataloging in a quieter corner. The Victorian library, initially a predominantly male domain, slowly but surely began to open its doors to women, changing the very fabric of the profession in ways that were both progressive and, frankly, a little complicated. In the earlier parts of the Victorian era, the image of the librarian was almost exclusively male, often an elderly, scholarly gentleman, or perhaps a retired clergyman. It was seen as a serious intellectual pursuit, perhaps even a bit dusty and cloistered, not exactly a role considered suitable for delicate sensibilities. However, as public libraries expanded rapidly in the latter half of the 19th century, the demand for staff grew exponentially. Libraries needed more hands on deck, and quite simply, they found those hands were often attached to women. This coincided with a broader societal shift, the increasing number of women entering the public workforce in general. Driven by economic necessity, changing social attitudes, and new educational opportunities that opened up professional avenues previously closed to them, particularly in fields like teaching and nursing. The reasons for hiring women in libraries were a fascinating mix of perceived gender roles and practical economics. Employers often believed that women possessed innate qualities perfectly suited for library work: patience, meticulousness, tidiness, and an attention to detail that could, frankly, drive a less organized man bonkers. They were seen as naturally adept at the repetitive tasks of shelving, mending, and cataloging. Plus, and this is where the gentle sarcasm comes in, they could be paid significantly less than men for performing the exact same duties. It was a classic case of getting more bang for your buck, even if that bang was a very quiet, dignified bang. Hiring a woman was often seen as a way to cut costs while maintaining a high standard of diligent work. However, the path for these pioneering women was far from smooth. They often faced significant prejudice and limitations. A quirky tidbit is the rather absurd arguments put forth by some men, and surprisingly, a few women against female librarians. These objections ranged from the idea that women were physically too weak to lift heavy books, to the notion that their emotional nature would render them incapable of the rigorous intellectual demands of cataloging, or that their delicate constitutions couldn't handle the drafts and dust of a library. One popular argument was that a single woman shouldn't work too closely with men, or that she might distract male patrons with her mere presence. It sounds utterly ridiculous now, doesn't it? As if the sight of a woman handling a dictionary would cause universal pandemonium. Despite these patronizing views, women quietly carved out their space. They typically started in lower-ranking, often clerical or assistant roles, rarely ascending to the most senior positions, which remained largely male-dominated until well into the 20th century. Promotions were scarce, and salaries were almost always lower than their male counterparts, even when performing identical work. You can imagine the quiet frustration, the polite smiles masking genuine ambition. Yet their dedication was undeniable. They organized, they cataloged, they assisted, and they often developed deep expertise in their fields, proving, unequivocally, their capability. This gradual influx of women led to what some historians call the feminization of librarianship. Particularly in America, by the turn of the century, the profession began to be associated more strongly with women, mirroring trends in other service-oriented, intellectually demanding fields. This brings us to a compelling point of debate. Historians still argue whether the increasing entry of women into librarianship was primarily a progressive step towards female empowerment and professional opportunity, or if it was predominantly driven by a cost-cutting measure that exploited cheaper female labor, inadvertently cementing librarianship as a lower-paid, less prestigious profession compared to other male-dominated fields. It's a complex legacy, showcasing both an expansion of opportunity for women and a reinforcement of existing wage disparities. So, as you observe the quiet diligence of a female librarian in a Victorian institution, remember the subtle revolution she represents. She is not just organizing books, she is pushing against societal expectations, carving out a professional space, and quietly proving that intellectual rigor and dedicated service know no gender. Her presence is a testament to perseverance. A silent battle won one carefully shelved book at a time, paving the way for countless women who would follow in her quiet footsteps. Having considered the human element of the Victorian library, from the diligent male librarians to the quietly pioneering women, let's now turn our attention to the subtle hum of innovation that occasionally pierced the prevailing quiet. If you're used to modern libraries with their banks of computers, Wi-Fi, and self-checkout kiosks, you might expect a Victorian library to be a technology-free zone, a quaint, untouched relic. But while the pace of change was glacial compared to today, these institutions were, in their own quiet way, laboratories for modest technological advancements. Remember the faint glow of gaslight we mentioned earlier that wasn't just atmospheric? It was a significant leap. Before gas illumination relied on candles or oil lamps, both of which were dim, smoky, and presented an even greater fire hazard than gas. The widespread adoption of gas lighting for public buildings, including libraries, was a major mainstream historical fact that revolutionized their operating hours. Suddenly, libraries weren't confined to daylight. They could extend their hours into the evening, offering access to knowledge to those who worked during the day. This meant more people could read, more people could learn, and more people could quietly fall asleep over a particularly dry treatise on political economy. The advent of gaslight literally extended the light of knowledge into the night, albeit with a faint smell of gas and the occasional hiss from a faulty burner. Beyond illumination, other subtle mechanical aids began to appear, especially in the larger, more progressive libraries. You might stumble upon an early book conveyor system, a rudimentary set of pulleys and belts designed to transport requested volumes from a remote stack area to the main circulation desk. These were often clunky, noisy, and probably broke down more often than they worked, but they represented an ambition to move beyond purely manual labor. Imagine a rather grumpy contraption that sounded like a small, asthmatic dragon, slowly delivering your copy of Great Expectations. One particularly intriguing and somewhat quirky piece of technology that found its way into some of the most advanced Victorian libraries was the pneumatic tube system. Yes, you heard that right. Pneumatic tubes. These were a network of sealed tubes through which cylindrical containers, called carriers, could be propelled by compressed air. Librarians would write a request slip, pop it into a carrier, and send it whizzing off to the distant stacks. Moments later, a librarian in the stacks would receive the request, retrieve the book, and send it back through the tubes. It was the original express delivery service for books, decades before Amazon even dreamed of drones. It's almost too futuristic for the dusty, quiet setting. Isn't it like a tiny, polite missile delivery system for knowledge? While not universally adopted due to cost and complexity, it's a testament to the inventive spirit trying to improve efficiency even in the most traditional of settings. Heating and ventilation, while often imperfect, also saw innovations. Early steam radiators gradually replaced open fires, offering a slightly more consistent, if still uneven, warmth. Attempts were made to design better air circulation systems, though the science of environmental control was still very much in its infancy. These improvements, however incremental, were crucial for preserving both the comfort of the patrons and, more importantly, the delicate paper of the books. A comfortable reader is a happy reader, and a well-preserved book is a readable book, which, one would hope, was the ultimate goal. Yet, for all these fascinating, albeit slow, technological advancements, there was often a certain skepticism or resistance to radical change. The core work of librarianship, the careful classification, the precise handling of books, the personalized assistance to readers remained deeply human-centric. The prevailing sentiment was often one of cautious pragmatism rather than eager adoption of every new gadget. It was less about disruption and more about subtle enhancement. And this leads us to a fascinating point of contemplation. Historians still argue whether these technological innovations significantly improve the core efficiency of Victorian libraries, or if they were often more symbolic gestures towards modernity, showcasing a desire to keep pace with the industrial age rather than truly transforming the fundamental nature of library work. Were they genuinely transformative, or just fancy window dressing for what remained a very hands-on, human-driven operation? It's a quiet debate that echoes through the annals of library history. So, as you imagine the soft hiss of a gaslight or the faint whoosh of a pneumatic tube, remember that even in the quietest corners of the Victorian era, the slow gears of progress were turning. These subtle innovations, though unassuming, played their part in shaping the modern library. One whisper of compressed air and one extended reading hour at a time. Leaving behind the subtle hum of early technology, we shift our focus to the grander social purpose that underpinned every brick and book of the Victorian public library. These weren't just buildings filled with paper. They were conceived as powerful instruments of social uplift, quiet engines of moral improvement, and beacons of self-betterment for the burgeoning masses. In a world grappling with the rapid changes of industrialization, growing urban populations, and widespread poverty, the library was positioned as a dignified alternative to the pub, the gambling den, or the less savory entertainments of the street. Imagine, if you will, the vision a working man, after a long day in the factory or on the docks, instead of drowning his sorrows in cheap gin, would seek solace and enlightenment within the hushed grandeur of the library. Here, he could pore over volumes on mechanics, history, or philosophy, slowly equipping himself with the knowledge to improve his lot, to become a more responsible citizen, or perhaps simply to find a quiet escape from the grim realities of his daily grind. This was a core tenet of the library movement, deeply intertwined with the broader Victorian social reform efforts and the temperance movement. Libraries were seen as offering a wholesome, improving alternative, a place where minds could be sharpened instead of dulled, and where civic virtue could be quietly cultivated. It was a noble ambition, even if you suspect a few patrons still snuck in a hip flask. The types of books initially emphasized for public consumption reflected this mission. You'd find extensive collections of non-fiction practical guides on trades and crafts, historical accounts, biographies of great figures, scientific treatises, and, of course, volumes on ethics and morality. The idea was to create a people's university, a place where anyone, regardless of their financial means, you could pursue an education. Librarians actively guided readers towards these improving works, often holding informal consultations to suggest suitable reading for those eager to learn. It wasn't just about providing books, it was about providing the right books, the ones that promised to elevate the mind and soul. This emphasis on didactic literature often led to interesting, and sometimes rather amusing, internal debates. A quirky tidbit is the ongoing struggle within many Victorian libraries regarding the acceptance of fiction. While some embraced it as a legitimate form of entertainment and moral instruction, others viewed novels as frivolous, time-wasting, or even morally dangerous. Particularly for women and the young, librarians were often caught between public demand for light reading and the prevailing institutional belief that libraries should primarily promote serious literature. You can almost hear the whispered arguments, but Mr. Jenkins, Jane Eyre has such valuable lessons on fortitude countered by, nonsense, Miss Peabody. It's merely a flight of fancy and a waste of good shelf space. It was a constant balancing act between being an educational institution and a place of public pleasure, a tension that surprisingly still exists in some corners of the library world today. Beyond providing books, many public libraries also hosted lectures, reading groups, and educational initiatives, transforming themselves into genuine community hubs. Imagine attending an evening lecture on the wonders of the steam engine, or a spirited debate on the future of the British Empire, all held within the hushed dignity of the main reading hall. These events further cemented the library's role as a cornerstone of intellectual and social life, a space where ideas could be freely exchanged, albeit with a strict adherence to proper decorum and the occasional stern look from a supervising librarian. However, for all the grand intentions and the undeniable benefits, historians still argue whether these Victorian libraries truly transformed the social landscape and provided genuine upward mobility for the broad working class, or if their impact was more limited, primarily serving those already inclined towards self-improvement and benefiting the burgeoning middle class. Did they truly bridge the chasm of class? Or did they simply provide a slightly more polished stepping stone for those already poised to climb? It's a complex question, and the answer likely lies in the countless individual stories of quiet transformation, many of which remain untold, lost to the silent turning of pages. Regardless of the precise sociological impact, one thing is certain: the Victorian Public Library stood as a powerful symbol of aspiration. It was a place where knowledge was revered, where intellectual curiosity was encouraged, and where, if only for a few quiet hours, the weight of class distinction could be lessened by the shared pursuit of understanding. It was a testament to the enduring belief that knowledge truly was power, and that access to it could, indeed, uplift a nation, one quiet reader at a time. Having explored the grand social ambitions of Victorian libraries, it's time to gently sweep aside some of the dusty misconceptions that still cling to the image of the Victorian librarian. You might picture them as stern, bespectacled figures, barely daring to breathe, forever shushing any errant rustle of a page. While a certain quiet demeanor was indeed expected and cultivated, to reduce these individuals to mere silent book stewards would be to miss the extraordinary depth of their dedication and the often unsung heroism of their daily work. They were far from meek. They were quiet powerhouses of knowledge and order. Forget the stereotype of the dull, uninspired custodian. The truth is, a Victorian librarian was a master of organization, a keen observer of human nature, and a dedicated public servant. They possessed an encyclopedic knowledge not only of their collection, but often of the various academic fields it covered. Their minds were constantly whirring, connecting ideas, remembering intricate classification numbers, and anticipating the needs of their patrons. It required a unique blend of intellectual curiosity and an almost Zen-like patience, particularly when dealing with a particularly demanding scholar who insisted on retrieving a rare, obscure text from the highest, dustiest shelf. Their work, though largely behind the scenes, was fundamentally about service and public access. They didn't just guard books, they curated knowledge. They helped shape nascent readers, guided scholars, and quietly enforced the rules that allowed such a complex institution to function. This was a critical distinction. As the field slowly began to professionalize, the late 19th century saw the very beginnings of library science emerging as a distinct academic discipline, moving beyond simply being a job for retired scholars or quiet gentlemen. It began to be recognized as a profession requiring specialized training in classification, administration, and public service, laying the groundwork for the modern library schools we know today. So, your quiet, bookish librarian wasn't just a book handler, they were a foundational figure in a burgeoning academic field. Of course, life in a library wasn't always perfectly serene. Librarians, despite their best efforts, occasionally faced challenges that required more than just a polite shush. A quirky tidbit is the rather delicate art of dealing with unruly patrons or unusual requests. Imagine a determined individual attempting to steal a rare map by subtly tearing it out of a volume, a surprisingly common problem. I might add, or a slightly inebriated gentleman attempting to debate the merits of socialist poetry at a volume just slightly above a whisper. The librarian couldn't resort to shouting or physical force. Their authority lay in their quiet assertiveness, their ability to maintain decorum with a carefully worded suggestion or a calmly delivered warning. It required a poker face and nerves of steel, often solving minor crises with nothing more than a disapproving glance and a very stern posture. It's like being a ninja of polite conflict resolution, moving silently but with absolute authority. Furthermore, historians still argue whether the professionalization of librarianship truly elevated their social standing or merely formalized existing practices, cementing them as respected but ultimately low-paid civil servants. Did their quiet work truly influence public discourse, or did they primarily reflect the intellectual currents rather than shape them? It's a subtle distinction, but one that speaks to the often underestimated power of those who control access to information. While they may not have been fiery orators or political leaders, their quiet dedication to organizing and disseminating knowledge undoubtedly provided the fertile ground for many of the era's great intellectual and social movements to flourish. So, when you think of a Victorian librarian, try to imagine beyond the dusty caricature. See the intellectual curiosity, the painstaking precision, the quiet strength required to manage thousands of volumes and hundreds of patrons, day after day. See the gentle hand mending a torn page, the keen eye spotting a misplaced book, the patient voice guiding a curious mind. They were not just guardians of books. They were unsung heroes of knowledge, preserving the past, illuminating the present, and quietly building the foundations for a more informed future. One hushed moment and one diligently performed duty at a time. Their quiet diligence was a form of silent heroism, a testament to the profound power of unassuming labor. As you observe the quiet determination of the Victorian librarian, you might start to appreciate not just their intellectual prowess, but their constant, often silent, battle against an array of relentless enemies. These were not external foes like rampaging barbarians or rival empires. No, these were far more insidious, invisible, and persistent the forces of nature, time, and decay, constantly conspiring against the delicate, cherished books. Imagine, if you will, the relentless accumulation of dust. In an era before vacuum cleaners and sophisticated air filtration, every open window, every sweeping skirt, every person moving through the grand halls contributed to a fine, pervasive layer of grime. This wasn't just aesthetic. Dust contains tiny abrasive particles that slowly, but surely, wear down paper fibers and bindings, like 1,000 microscopic sandpaper sheets. It settles into every crevice, every page fold, a constant reminder of the outside world slowly encroaching on the pristine stillness within. Librarians engaged in a Sisyphean task of dusting, wiping, and polishing, knowing full well that within hours, the silent invasion would begin anew. Beyond dust, the very environment conspired against the collections. The gaslight we admired for extending reading hours also released harmful chemicals that slowly, imperceptibly, yellowed and embrittled paper. Coal fires, while providing warmth, contributed soot and acidic particles to the air. Then there was the fluctuating climate within these grand, drafty buildings. Periods of damp could encourage insidious mold and mildew, leaving telltale musty smells and irreversible stains, while excessive dryness could make paper brittle and bindings crack. There was no sophisticated climate control, no automated humidity regulators. It was a constant manual struggle against the capricious whims of the weather and indoor conditions. Perhaps the most alarming, and certainly the creepiest, threats were the biological ones. Books, being organic matter, were a tempting feast for a variety of unwelcome guests. We've mentioned actual bookworms, beetle larvae that literally bored through volumes, leaving perfectly round holes. But there were also silverfish, munching on the starchy glues and bindings, and various fungi, feasting on damp paper. Rodents, too, found libraries surprisingly cozy, gnawing on bindings and leaving telltale droppings. A quirky tidbit is the rather desperate measures librarians sometimes took to combat these infestations. This could involve everything from applying various chemical concoctions to books, some containing arsenic or mercury, which certainly dealt with the pests but probably weren't great for the librarians either, to fumigating entire sections of the library with noxious fumes, requiring a temporary closure and a very brave staff. And, of course, the classic solution cats. Many Victorian libraries employed feline residents to patrol the stacks. Their quiet prowls a natural, if not entirely foolproof, deterrent to mice and other small creatures. It was a rather adorable, if slightly unsanitary, form of biological pest control. This constant battle against decay became even more pronounced with a mainstream historical fact: the shift in paper production. While older books often used durable, acid-free rag paper, the Industrial Revolution brought about the widespread use of cheaper wood pulp paper. This paper, though more accessible, contained acids that, over time, would cause the pages to become brittle, yellow, and eventually crumble, a process known as slow fires. Librarians of the late Victorian era were unknowingly inheriting a ticking time bomb. Volumes that were literally self-destructing from within, a silent, inevitable process of disintegration. They couldn't see the future, but they certainly saw the results of this unseen chemical warfare. The long-term effects of these environmental factors and material deficiencies meant that a significant portion of a librarian's quiet service was dedicated to simply slowing the inevitable. They were the unsung conservators, making valiant efforts with the tools and knowledge available to them. And this raises an interesting point of academic discussion. Historians still argue whether Victorian librarians, despite their practical efforts, truly understood the underlying science of decay, or if their preservation methods were more a process of trial and error, based on observation and inherited wisdom rather than rigorous scientific study. Did they fully grasp the chemical processes at play? Or were they simply performing heroic, yet ultimately limited interventions against forces they couldn't entirely comprehend? It's a testament to their dedication that they fought so hard against such persistent, often invisible adversaries, ensuring that knowledge, however fragile its vessel, would endure for as long as humanly possible. Having observed the quiet, systematic battle against decay, let's now peel back another layer of the Victorian library's mystique and focus on the individuals themselves. While the prevailing image of a librarian might be one of uniform quietude, beneath those subdued exteriors often lay fascinating, sometimes wonderfully eccentric, minds and hidden passions. These weren't just cogs in a meticulously designed machine. They were vibrant, albeit often quietly so, human beings. And their quirks added an unexpected splash of color to the otherwise monochromatic world of books and ledgers. Imagine, if you will, old Mr. Abernathy, a librarian from a provincial town. On the surface, he was the epitome of Victorian rectitude, impeccably dressed, precise in his movements, and possessed of a truly awe-inspiring capacity for silence. He could shush a miscreant with merely a raised eyebrow, a feat of nonverbal communication that would make a modern-day diplomat envious. But Mr. Abernathy had a secret: quiet passion cryptograms and obscure historical ciphers. He spent his evenings not reading the latest Dickens, but painstakingly trying to decode forgotten medieval manuscripts, or deciphering the cryptic notes in the margins of ancient maps within the library's rare collections. This, you see, was his quiet thrill, his personal intellectual playground. He probably kept a very precise, entirely indecipherable personal journal. This fascination wasn't entirely unrelated to his work. While it wasn't a standard part of his job description, his keen eye for hidden patterns and meticulous attention to detail, honed by his cryptographic pursuits, made him extraordinarily adept at identifying errors in early printed catalogs or recognizing obscure references that might otherwise be missed. This informal expertise could lead to the development of specialized collections within libraries, often driven by the unique interests or expertise of a particular librarian. A librarian passionate about local history might meticulously collect pamphlets, newspapers, and ephemera related to their town, creating invaluable archives that wouldn't exist otherwise. It was a kind of silent intellectual self-selection, where a librarian's private passions subtly influenced the public offering. Sometimes, these personal quirks manifested in more amusing ways. A quirky tidbit for you: some librarians developed highly idiosyncratic methods for shelving or organizing their own personal sections of the library, often with internal logic known only to them. Imagine a system based on the perceived moral standing of the author, or even by the shade of the book's binding, rather than any recognized classification. A new assistant, upon trying to find a book in such a section, would undoubtedly experience a mild existential crisis. Where is literature of mild disagreement? Mr. Abernathy. Ah, that's between unbridled optimism and polite regret. Naturally. Such systems were, of course, unofficial and perhaps the despair of their colleagues, but they speak to the deep personal connection these individuals formed with their collections. We might also consider the librarian who is a quiet, unassuming poet, scribbling verses on discarded request slips in the quiet hours after the library closed, or the one who was a keen amateur botanist, meticulously pressing leaves and flowers found on their walk to work. Their desk drawers filled not just with ink and paper, but with the quiet trophies of their observations. These hidden lives remind us that beneath the surface of institutional formality, human beings with rich inner worlds diligently performed their duties. It was a life of quiet dedication, but not necessarily a life devoid of personal passion. However, this raises an interesting academic question. Historians still argue whether these individual eccentricities and personal intellectual pursuits ultimately aided or hindered the broader professionalization of librarianship. Did they contribute to the field's rich tapestry and specialized knowledge, or did they sometimes make the profession seem less systematic and more akin to an antiquarian hobby? Was the balance between their professional duties and their personal intellectual pursuits a harmonious one, or did one sometimes overshadow the other in the quiet confines of their minds? It's a debate about the tension between the individual spirit and institutional uniformity. A subtle dance performed within the hushed halls. So, the next time you imagine a Victorian librarian, perhaps allow your mind to conjure not just a rigid figure, but a quiet, complex soul. Consider the secret passions, the hidden curiosities, the unique intellectual pursuits that simmered beneath the surface of their quiet, meticulous lives. They were not merely guardians of books, they were also, in their own way, silent, fascinating books themselves, each with their own unique story bound within the covers of their quiet dedication. From the charming eccentricities of individual librarians, we now turn to their grandest, most enduring contribution, the quiet organizational principles that continue to underpin our information-rich world. Even today. You see, the Victorian Library wasn't just a place of quiet reading. It was the crucible where the very foundations of modern information science were forged. The careful, meticulous work of those quiet figures laid the groundwork for everything from how your local library operates to how a search engine organizes the vast chaos of the internet. Think about the core problems faced by a Victorian librarian: how to acquire, organize, preserve, and provide access to a rapidly expanding body of knowledge are precisely the same challenges we grapple with in the digital age. They just had ink and paper, and we have ones and zeros. The solutions they painstakingly developed, often through trial and error, proved remarkably robust and adaptable. The Dewey Decimal Classification System, which we touched on earlier, is a prime example of a mainstream historical fact that continues to have a foundational impact. While many libraries now use the Library of Congress classification, or hybrid systems, Dewey's conceptual framework for organizing all human knowledge into a logical, hierarchical system was revolutionary and remains incredibly influential. It taught us how to categorize the world, how to make sense of disparate subjects by grouping them into understandable, searchable chunks. Furthermore, the rigorous development of standardized cataloging rules, which began in earnest in the Victorian era and evolved into comprehensive guides like the Anglo-American cataloging rules, provided the essential grammar for describing information. Every book, every periodical, every pamphlet needed a consistent way to be recorded, ensuring that a book cataloged in London could be understood and located in Manchester. This might sound painfully dull, like reading a phone book from the 1880s, but it was the intellectual bedrock upon which all future information retrieval systems would be built. Without these painstaking rules, libraries would be utterly unmanageable, a glorious but inaccessible mess. It's like trying to build a skyscraper without blueprints. Eventually, it's going to lean, probably quite a bit. And this leads us to a rather fascinating, quirky tidbit: the direct lineage from the physical card catalog to modern digital databases. When a Victorian librarian meticulously filled out a card for a book, recording its title, author, subject headings, and classification number, they were, in essence, creating what we now call metadata. Each field on that little card was a piece of data describing the book, making it searchable and discoverable. So, when you type a query into a modern library database or even Google, you are, in a very real sense, interacting with the ghostly echoes of those Victorian librarians. Their analog metadata systems were the direct ancestors of the digital ones that power our entire online world. It's a quiet legacy that powers everything from Netflix recommendations to scientific research databases. Who knew a handwritten card could be so revolutionary? The librarian's mindset, that patient dedication to accuracy, organization, and service, continues to be vital. While the tools have changed, the fundamental principles of information management remain. Modern librarians are no longer just guardians of physical volumes. They are navigators of digital seas, curators of online resources, and educators in digital literacy. They still organize, they still preserve, and they still provide access, albeit often through screens rather than gaslight. The quiet heroes of the Victorian era, meticulously tending to their dusty shelves, effectively invented the very grammar of information that we now take for granted. However, a compelling question for contemporary academics is whether the digital age truly represents a fundamental break from these Victorian principles, or merely a continuation with new tools. Historians still argue whether the shift from physical books to digital information is a revolutionary rupture that demands entirely new ways of thinking about knowledge, or if it's simply an evolution of the same core challenges. Are we truly in a post-library age, or are we just experiencing the latest iteration of the Victorian ideal of universal access to organized information? It's a debate about continuity versus revolution, and the answer lies somewhere in the quiet hum of a server farm and the rustle of a turning page, both echoing the same foundational desire to make sense of the world. So, as you drift towards sleep, remember that the seamless flow of information you experience daily owes a quiet, profound debt to those Victorian librarians. Their diligent hands, their patient minds, and their unwavering belief in the power of organized knowledge laid the invisible, silent pathways that lead us through the vast landscapes of information, connecting past, present, and future in a continuous, quiet journey. As our quiet journey through the hushed corridors of the Victorian Library draws to a close, you might feel a profound sense of the enduring impact of these seemingly unassuming institutions. We've traced the diligent hands of librarians, marveled at the grand architecture, deciphered the intricate systems, and observed the quiet patrons seeking knowledge. Now, as the faint glow of the gaslight seems to soften even further, casting longer, gentler shadows, we can reflect on the lingering echoes of this quieter time. The legacy of the Victorian Library is not just in the millions of books preserved or the classification system still in use. It's in the very idea of public access to knowledge, the belief that information should be a right, not a privilege. It's a foundational concept that continues to evolve. From those grand, silent halls, libraries have steadily but surely moved beyond being purely physical repositories. The gradual shift from libraries as mere book warehouses to vibrant centers of community engagement and digital resources truly blossomed in the late 20th century, building directly upon the Victorian ideal of civic uplift, just adapting it for a new era. They're still there to help you. Just now, they might also teach you how to code, or help you fill out your taxes, or host a very enthusiastic Dungeons & Dragons club. Even today, when you step into a modern library, you can often feel the faint imprint of its Victorian ancestors. Perhaps it's the high ceilings, the quiet reverence for books, or even the distinct quirky tidbit of bibliosmia, that unique comforting scent of old paper, leather, and dust that still clings to venerable collections. It's a sensory memory, a silent whisper from the past, reminding you of the thousands of hours of quiet concentration that once filled these spaces. You might find yourself instinctively lowering your voice, a habit ingrained from centuries of enforced silence, even if the only sound is the gentle hum of the air conditioning. This very quiet, this deliberate calm, was both an architectural design feature and a deeply ingrained cultural expectation. And this leads to a fascinating consideration. Historians still argue whether the quiet of the Victorian library was a natural reflection of the era's temperament, a genuine yearning for contemplative solitude, or whether it was an ideal rigorously enforced to maintain order and decorum amongst a diverse public. Was it an organic atmosphere or a carefully constructed one, designed to tame the boisterousness of urban life and promote a specific kind of scholarly behavior? Regardless, the effect was profound, creating a unique sanctuary where minds could expand without the cacophony of the outside world. The quiet lives of Victorian librarians, their painstaking work, their battles against dust and decay, their dedication to organization and service, built something truly monumental. They were the silent architects of our information age, laying down the tracks for knowledge to travel freely, often unnoticed, but always indispensable. They were the quiet heroes who understood that true power lay not in shouting, but in the gentle turning of a page, and the quiet illumination of a curious mind. Now, as the last faint echoes of our journey soften, let the quietude of these historical sanctuaries wash over you. Feel the gentle weight of all those forgotten stories, the silent hum of knowledge that still permeates the air. Let your thoughts drift, unburdened by the digital clamor of your day, the diligent hands, the precise systems. The quiet dedication, all of it fades into a comforting blur, leaving only the tranquil essence of learning and peace. Allow your breath to deepen, your muscles to relax. The grand halls, the dusty shelves, the earnest faces they recede, becoming a soft, calming memory. There's nothing left to do now but surrender to the stillness. Let the quiet whispers of history lull you gently, deeper and deeper, into a restorative rest. Sweet dreams.